It's good to see each one tonight and trust that our time together will benefit us and glorify God in heaven. Sunday morning, we're going to be having our condensed Sunday, fifth Sunday schedule. I think some of you have read in the news sheet that immediately after services tonight, if y'all can help with the removal of the walls and also the setting up the tables and the chairs, it would be muchly appreciated. Jerry, the third knob down is the bass. It's rattling in my ears. Can you move it just a little and see if that will help? If that doesn't, then give it a little more treble. That's the top knob. Yeah. Is that better? Is that better for y'all? Or was it just bothering me? It was about to drive me nuts. I'm already crazy, so. During Bible class, we're going to be presenting the trip to Kiev. Stephen and Don will be sharing, and I will be sharing with you about the Vinograder Church that we assist in Kiev, and the 10th anniversary. I think it'll be a very good time for all of us. And then worship as normal. Potluck, always potluck is a good thing. Churches survive on potluck dinners, gain a lot of weight, but it's a good thing. And then about 1 o'clock, we will have our afternoon service. Marcus is planning that. I know it'll be a good time for us. Also, beginning next Wednesday night, the assembly here in the auditorium will begin at 5:30. At 5:30 till about 6:20 or so. And then Wednesday Fest will be going on starting about 6 o'clock until about 6:45, 6:50. And then those who cannot come to the 5:30 or who choose not to come to the 5:30, the 7:15 classes will be held. There'll be individual classes in the fellowship hall. And next week, I think y'all will all assemble in here. Do I remember that? Going to assemble in here and explain the protocol, and then everyone will go to those classes. We're going to be doing this at least until the time changes back in the spring, and maybe even closer to the end of school. No decision has been made there. But so beginning next week, we have the early service, and then the 7:15 service for those who want to avail themselves of that opportunity. I know you probably can't see, well, maybe you can better than I think you can, but it's all pretty small. A lot of people, biblical figures up there: Abraham and Jacob and Moses and Naomi and Timothy and Jonah and Miriam and Thomas and John and Peter. You know what they all had in common? Every single one of them had two major things in common. They're really one and the same thing, but we can identify them differently. They had sin. They're imperfect. Stop and think about it. Imperfect. And yet, we look at these names and we say, hey, a lot of those names are in chapter 11 of Hebrews in the honor roll of faith. Man, what's going on? You got old Moses. Moses was an excuse maker. You remember how he just tried to excuse himself from becoming the man that delivered Israel? Jacob just out and out lied. Didn't just deceive, just out and out lied. Timothy had ulcers. Abraham was too old. Naomi was a widow. Peter was a braggart. Jonah ran from God. Miriam was a gossip. Thomas doubted. Martha was a worrywart. Sounds a lot like us. And yet, God still used them all, every single one of them, for His purposes. When I was growing up, I pretty well had a skewed view of a lot of Old Testament characters in particular, and even some New Testament characters. I thought that they evidently were just absolutely perfect. I mean, you can't look at the story of David and Goliath and not come away with saying, man, David was, wow. He was a man after God's own heart. And we're going to talk about that a lot this evening. And yet David, if you study his life, was a scoundrel in a lot of ways. And Moses did a lot of things right, but Moses did some significant things wrong. And you can just go down the list. And as you go down the list, you begin to say, hey, what's the deal here? What's going on here? Well, I think the answer to that question is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 27 through verse 29. God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong. And the base things of the world and the despised things of the world, God has chosen the things that are not, so that He may nullify the things that are, so that no man may boast before God. I don't know how many times I've read that passage of Scripture, multiples over the years, just dwell upon it from time to time. Especially I'll think about it in those situations where maybe I've been in a discussion with someone and before it was all said and done, they had humiliated me because I was not as smart as they were. And even though I would try to offer God's explanation, they would come up with things that sometimes I'd never even heard of. And you start trying to figure out, am I worthy in the kingdom? Can I do something in the kingdom? And you look at this, God's chosen the foolish things. God's chosen the weak things, the base things, the despised. God's chosen those things so that the glory will not be in man, the glory will be in God. You remember Paul as he talked about the thorn that he had in the flesh, and he said, I besought the Lord multiple times, 3 times, to take that thorn out. And what was God's reply to him? He says, in your weakness I can use you. I'm paraphrasing quite liberally, but I want you to get the point. In your weakness I can use you. It's when you begin to think mightily of yourself and powerfully of yourself, that's when the problems are. When you're weak, I can use you. So my grace is sufficient for you, God tells Paul. Paul wrestled with it. Romans chapter 7, spent a little time there. Oh, what a wrestling match Paul went through. Why? Because he, with his heart, with his mind, he really wanted to serve Christ and God, but he just kept failing. And he's the one that the Spirit gave these words to that he wrote. Well, tonight I want to talk about this, and I want to talk about it from the standpoint of the story of David. But before we get to David, I want to start with Samuel anointing King Saul. The people come up to the prophet of God, Samuel, and they want a king. And Samuel goes before the Lord, and the Lord says, Samuel, they're going to regret it, but I'm going to let them have a king. Samuel he's distressed about this. He's distressed that they don't want God to be their ultimate king. And so he's concerned, very deeply concerned. But he does what God tells him to do. And so he anoints Saul, son of Kish, to be king. Now, Saul probably had the best of intentions. In fact, I tend to think that Saul had the best of intentions. But his best of intentions turned out to not be the best of intentions. When you get to 1 Samuel chapter 13, you've got Saul looking at the Philistines in the face there at Gilgal. And the children of Israel aren't necessarily being ruly. They aren't really behaving. And Samuel had said, I'll be there in 7 days, and Samuel hasn't shown up. And it's kind of a problematic situation for Saul. We pick it up in verse 8. Now he waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul began to think this over. How am I going to handle this situation? I can't go into battle without God's blessing. Samuel hasn't shown up. The Philistines are here. The people are scattering. This is going to be an absolute disaster. Now, Saul's basic problem is he just doesn't understand the ways of God. He doesn't understand that God, when he's in control, is in control, and so he begins to take things into his own hand. And so he asks, where's the peace offering? Where's the burnt offering? And he offers the burnt offering. Verse 9, the last part. And just as soon as he finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel shows up. Now, I've always felt like that God was testing Saul. And I've always thought that Samuel maybe was doing this on purpose to see what Saul would do. But I don't know that I could prove any of that. But what we do see is that Saul, with an arrogant conscience, a clear conscience, I don't necessarily know. I couldn't judge the intentions of his heart. But Saul goes ahead and does what he should not have done. He should have waited on Samuel. And the end result is a very significant price that Saul pays. Your kingdom shall not endure. That's what Samuel tells him. Because you have violated God's design and desire, your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Well, those are strong words. But they're words I think we ought to pay attention to, especially in a time in which people are wanting to do their own thing when it comes to God and God's will, when it comes to the Bible. Samuel says, your kingdom's done for. In fact, this happens in stages. And Saul, of course, laments. But it's not going to do any good, because Saul needed to realize initially that he needed to be the person that God could use. And the person that God could use was the person who had a heart after God's heart. And we'll talk about that just a little bit more as we get into David. Well, let's jump into the New Testament where David is discussed. And look at what is said in Acts chapter 13 about God's choice here. They asked for a king. God gave them Saul the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. After he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king. And why? Well, concerning David, whom he also testified and said, I found David the son of Jesse, a man after my heart, who will do all my will. This is kind of curious to me, because if you know the story of David, you know that there's a lot of inequity that goes on in this situation. First thing that you contemplate is that David is the most unlikely of choices for being the king. You remember Saul's description, how tall and how robust he was and how powerful as a man he was. And he had so many characteristics that you would look at and say, wow, this is really the guy who can do God's bidding, can do God's will. But David, I don't know about David. When Samuel is told to go to Jesse's house, and there he's going to find the successor to Saul, Jesse, David's father, doesn't give David the time of day. When Samuel comes, Jesse didn't bother bringing David in from the fields. After all, he is a shepherd boy. Now, he may have been a man by this time in terms of age, but he was low man on the totem pole in the family in every way. That even his own father didn't think that he had any value as far as this situation was concerned. Well, Samuel, who hasn't been introduced to David yet, but Samuel takes a look at the older brother and he looks at Eliab and he thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 6. And we were talking about being respecter of persons. I guess it was in Sunday night's class. And Samuel gives us a good illustration of someone who made a judgment based upon what he saw with his eyes. Well-dressed, physical stature, lots of strength, looks like a leader. We see that in political races all the time. Perception, whether it's reality or not, perception. And Samuel's very excited about him, but God shuts the excitement down in the very next verse. The Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I've rejected him. For God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. How many times have we observed that passage? And yet, how many times when we're making judgments about so many things in life, do we base it upon outward appearance? We base it upon not what we see in terms of the heart and the character of the individual, but we base it upon what we see in the externals. Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees. Man looks at the externals. God looks at the internals. We still haven't gotten down to old David. David is a cheese carrier. His father sends him with supplies for his brothers who are there as Saul is going up against the Philistines. And so he takes the cheeses and he takes the other provisions. And he's involved in the process of looking at the situation, and he's talking with the men and et cetera. And that older brother looks at David with disdain. He says, you're just here to see the fight, the battle. Go on home, is what really he's trying to say to David. You're not a man yet. Imagine the brother was pretty surprised when he looked up and he saw David with just his slingshot, stones out of the brook, going out to meet Goliath. And Goliath looks at David, and Goliath shows disdain toward David. What are they doing, sending this little ruddy pup out here to fight me? When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy with a handsome appearance. Now, we know the rest of the story, because we know that David understood that if God wanted Goliath dead, all he had to do was put the stone in the slingshot and sling that thing in the general direction of Goliath, and it was going to hit him in the head. That was the faith that David had. He had been the killer of bears and the killer of lions, mountain lions. And God had been with him, and he understood this. But he's still an unlikely character. Changing gears just a little bit, but after he is appointed, we get one of those stories which really shows us the problems that David had in his character. You remember he had spent a few years among the Philistines, and he had been plundering them, and he had been murdering them right and left. And that's not a very good representative picture of a person who's a man after God's own heart, but that's what he did. And then we get that most famous story about David not being able to sleep, and he's up on the roof of the palace, and he looks over on the neighboring roof evidently, and David saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. And so David sent and inquired about the woman, and one told him, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" David knew exactly how wrong it was for him to be doing what he now does. And he sends messengers and took her, and when she came to him, he lay with her. A little bit later, you find her with child, and she sends message. And then he arranges for Uriah to be murdered. Looks like it's happening in battle, but God knows. David, you think you're qualified for anything in spiritual pursuit? What's the point? What's the point? There's a passage we have in 2 Chronicles chapter 16 that I think indicates to us what the point is. For the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. Now, I have a problem here because I think that if a man's heart is completely God's, that he's not going to do sinful things. But the story of David argues with that. Because David does some sinful things, as we've seen with Bathsheba. And so we look at David and we say, you know, David, what gives you any qualification? Because your actions are not always right. In fact, your actions frequently are very sinful. Does God condone sinfulness? No, absolutely not. But God realizes that we all sin and fall short of God's glory. That there's none righteous, that all men sin, as the Roman writer makes so very clear in chapter 3 and chapter 5. That sin is our struggle, it's our battleground. I think that what we learn is it's what is our reaction to sin. You remember Nathan the prophet goes to David, excuse me. Nathan the prophet goes to David, and he tells David this story about a man who had a lot of sheep and another man who only had one. And the man who had the lot went and took the sheep of the one. Boy, David is filled with righteous indignation. David says, that guy ought to be killed. And Nathan the prophet looks at David right straight in the face and he says, David, you are the one. And all of a sudden, David's eyes are open. And this is what made the difference. David could have responded in a variety of ways. He could have said, well, I'm king. But he didn't do that. He could have said, well, yeah, that is bad. Boy, I'm so very, very sorry. But he didn't do that. Well, if she hadn't been out there bathing and been so beautiful, it's not my fault. I actually had a man give me that explanation for adultery one time. No, David didn't do that. David immediately repented of his sin. He faced it and he repented. And that, I think, is what makes him a man after God's own heart. Because David's heart and his desire was to do what God wanted. He didn't always allow that to rule. He didn't always allow that to happen. But that's the case with Moses, and that's the case with some of the others that we mentioned. And when a person is completely in heart attuned to God, will he sin? Yes, probably so. But how will he approach it? He's not going to be like Adam and says, this woman that you gave me, she made me eat. He's not going to be about like so many other excuse makers, like Moses, trying to get out of his responsibility that God wanted him to accept. That's the point. That's the point. I want this to be a lesson of encouragement to you, because if you're struggling and you're sometimes saying, I don't know whether I can keep on doing this, and you find yourself making mistakes and you work to correct those mistakes and you just make other mistakes, there's hope. Because what really is going to count in the end result is, are you going to let your heart and your desire be what God wants? And that's what will make the difference. Going back to Acts chapter 13, verse 22, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart. What made David a man after his heart? I think the last phrase is what defines it. Who will do all my will. Who will try to do it the way I've asked him to do it. And when he doesn't, he'll change. The second that he realizes that he needs to make that change, he'll change. If there was a word that we were going to use to describe what we were trying to say tonight, it would be the word consecration. Ran across a beautiful little story that I think will help you to understand this concept. A woman was doing some Bible study and she got to this word consecration and she was having trouble understanding it. So she goes to her preacher and she looks at the preacher and she says, I'm not sure I understand what it means to be consecrated to God. What is consecration? And the preacher reaches down and he picks up a sheet of paper and he hands her the sheet of paper. And he says, this is what consecration is. You take this blank sheet of paper and you sign your name at the bottom of it. And then you hand it to God and let Him fill in all the details. Consecration is when you sign your name at the bottom of this blank sheet and let God fill it in as He wills. That's the point. That's what made David, the man that we look at in the genealogy of Jesus, as a man after God's own heart, not because of his sinlessness or perfection, but because his heart was attuned to doing God's will. Are you and I consecrated to God as we ought to be? Only each one of us individually can answer that question. Consecration. When you sign your name at the bottom of the blank page, you say, "Here I am, Lord. Write your will." God's written His will. What we have to do is sign the paper and say, "I'm going to try to do your will with all of my heart." The lesson is yours. We're going to sing this song of invitation. There may be someone who has a need tonight in some way to be responsive to Christ. We want to give you that opportunity. If you need to become a Christian, if you need to ask for the prayers of the church, whatever it might be, if you need some encouragement, we want to encourage you. While together we stand and while we sing.